When queens fall, the world watches. But what happens when their departure from power is not just dramatic, but utterly shockingly bizarre? Forget gentle retirements or dignified handovers. We are talking about the wild, twisted tales of medieval queens from the 8th to the 14th centuries, whose reigns ended in ways that defy belief. Number 5. The Empress who blinded her son and met her own violent end. The air in Constantinople in the late 8th century was always thick with whispers of power, plots, and a very distinct aroma of incense mixed with the scent of the Bosphorus. Into this grand volatile city, a woman named Irene, from the city of Athens, had arrived. She was chosen as a bride for Leo IV, the Byzantine Emperor. She was young, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, but at first she was simply the Empress consort. When Leo IV died in 780 CE, their son, Constantine VI, was only 10 years old. Irene stepped up, taking the reins as regent for her young boy. Now, a regent's job is usually to guide and protect the young monarch until they are old enough to rule alone. But Irene was not just any regent. She was determined to keep her grip on power. She was a master manipulator, playing court factions against each other, ensuring her authority remained unchallenged. She famously brought back the veneration of icons, reversing the policy of her deceased husband, a move that pleased the powerful monastic communities and much of the populace, but upset parts of the army. This religious policy was a bold political statement showing everyone that she was in charge, not her young son, and not the soldiers. As Constantine VI grew older, he started to resent his mother's control. He was a young man, a legitimate emperor, and he wanted to rule in his own right. Gathered support from nobles and army officers who also chafed under Irene's iron rule. By 790 CE, the tension exploded. Constantine made his move, attempting to strip his mother of her power and exile her to the remote imperial palace of Eleutherion. It seemed like the end for Irene's regency, and perhaps her life in the inner circle of power. But Irene was not one to go quietly. She had spent years cultivating loyalty, building a network of supporters, and understanding the Byzantine court's complex web of allegiances. She launched a counter-offensive. She swayed the powerful palace guards, the tagmata, back to her side. She rallied the populace who admired her piety and strength. Within a few years, by 792 CE, she had managed to regain her lost influence, even forcing Constantine to acknowledge her as co-ruler. A truly extraordinary move for a mother and son. She even got the army to swear an oath of loyalty to both of them. An oath that placed her first in line. As long as you live, we will not accept your son as emperor. This co-rule was a fragile piece, and Irene knew it. Her son, despite the oaths, still wanted to be sole emperor. He tried again to sideline her, even making plans to capture her. But Irene was always a step ahead. She discovered his plots and decided to take drastic, brutal action. In 797 CE, she orchestrated the most chilling act of her reign. Her supporters seized Constantine VI. The imperial palace, which had seen so much intrigue and violence, witnessed something truly horrifying. Constantine VI was dragged to the very room where he had been born. There, by his mother's command, his eyes were gouged out. It was a gruesome, irreversible act, designed to make him incapable of ruling ever again, as blind men could not sit on the Byzantine throne. Chroniclers of the time report that he lingered for several days in terrible agony before finally succumbing to his wounds. This act cemented Irene's power in a way nothing else could. She was no longer just a regent or co-ruler. She was the sole reigning empress of the Byzantine Empire, the first woman in history to hold such power in her own right, ruling an empire that stretched from Italy to Asia Minor. Her rule as empress was marked by some administrative changes and further religious policy. But it was also a time of constant pressure. Her brutality towards her son had shocked many, even in an age accustomed to imperial violence. The European powers, particularly Charlemagne in the West, saw her rule as illegitimate, arguing that a woman could not hold imperial power. This led to a significant rift between the East and West. Rumors even circulated that Charlemagne, who had just been crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, might propose marriage to Irene, uniting the two empires. Whether this was a serious proposal or just a wild idea, it certainly added another layer of bizarre speculation to her reign. The sheer audacity of her reign, built on such a foundation of violence, could not last. In 802 CE, a group of high-ranking officials led by Nikephoros I, the empire's chief financial minister, launched a coup. They saw Irene as a tyrant, a woman who had broken natural laws and the rules of succession. They also felt she was mismanaging the empire's finances, squandering wealth. The coup was swift and decisive. Irene's supporters, perhaps weary of her ruthless tactics or simply outmaneuvered, abandoned her. Irene was seized in the palace, the same palace where she had commanded her son's blinding. She was formally deposed, stripped of all her imperial titles and power. The empress who had clawed her way to the very peak of power through such terrible means. Her abdication, though forced and brutal, was the culmination of a life lived on the razor's edge of ambition and violence. Nikephoros I, the new emperor, decided against executing her. Perhaps he feared the spiritual consequences or the wrath of her remaining supporters. Instead, he exiled her. She was sent to the island of Lesbos, a relatively remote and desolate place in the Aegean Sea. She was given a meager allowance, barely enough to sustain herself. The once mighty empress, who had commanded armies and blinded her own son, spent her final days in isolation, spinning wool to support herself, a stark and chilling contrast to her previous life of imperial luxury and absolute power. She died on Lesbos in 803 CE, just a year after her forced abdication. A bizarre and terrifying end to one of the most ruthless and determined women to ever sit on a throne. Her story remains a stark reminder of the dark side of ambition in the Byzantine Empire. Number 4. The empress who broke her sacred oath and was forced into a convent. In the glittering, complicated world of 11th century Constantinople, oaths meant something, especially for those at the top of the Byzantine Empire. Empress Eudocia Macrembolitissa was a woman of noble birth, intelligent and politically astute. She was married to Constantine X Ducas, a learned and respected emperor. Their marriage was a happy one, and they had several children, including a son, Michael, who was destined to inherit the throne. When Constantine X died in 1067 CE, Michael was still too young to rule alone. Eudocia, as his mother, stepped into the role of regent, holding the power of the vast Byzantine Empire in her hands. But there was a catch, a big one. Before his death, Emperor Constantine X, fearing that Eudocia might remarry and thus give control of the empire to an outsider, had made her swear a solemn oath. This oath, sworn before the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Senate, bound her never to marry again. It was a binding agreement, a public declaration of her intention to remain loyal to her deceased husband's family and to protect the succession of her sons. For a powerful empress, this was a huge sacrifice, essentially committing her to a life of perpetual widowhood in a male-dominated world, all to ensure the stability of the throne for her young children. Eudocia for a time honored her oath. She ruled as regent, overseeing the affairs of the empire, navigating the treacherous waters of court politics. However, the Byzantine Empire was facing severe external threats. In the east, the Seljuk Turks were becoming an increasingly powerful and aggressive force, constantly raiding Byzantine territory in Asia Minor. In the west, the Normans were encroaching on Byzantine lands. In Italy, the military situation was dire, and the empire needed strong leadership. A visible, powerful emperor to lead its armies, not just a regent. Eudocia soon realized that a woman, no matter how capable, would struggle to command the respect and authority needed to lead the army in war. The generals, powerful and often rebellious, were always looking for opportunities to seize power for themselves. The empire needed a strong hand, a military man, to defend its borders. She began to look for a husband despite her oath. She found him in Romanos Diogenes, a respected and skilled general. Romanos had proven his military prowess and was a Midic leader. Eudocia saw him as the ideal candidate to protect the empire and secure her son's future. But there was the oath. Breaking it would be a huge scandal, a moral and political disaster. Patriarch of Constantinople, John Cephallinos, was a powerful figure, and he would surely object. The Senate, which had witnessed her oath, would also be outraged. Eudocia, being a master strategist, concocted an elaborate plan. She approached the Patriarch in secret, pretending to seek guidance on a matter of conscience. She spun a tale that one of her deceased husband's brothers, a general named John Kukuaz, was planning to marry her. She presented this as a dangerous union, an incestuous one according to the Church's strict rules, and one that would disrupt the peaceful succession. She asked the Patriarch for permission to break her oath and remarry, specifically to prevent this disastrous incestuous union. The Patriarch, perhaps falling for her deception, or perhaps seeing the political necessity, granted her a special dispensation, allowing her to break her oath provided she did not marry Kukuaz. The Patriarch's reluctant permission. Eudocia revealed her true intention. She announced her marriage to Romanos. Diogenes. The court and the public were stunned. The Patriarch, realizing he had been tricked, was furious, but it was too late. On the very next day, January 1st, 1068 CE, Eudocia married Romanos Diogenes in a grand ceremony. He was immediately crowned co-emperor, taking the name Romanos IV. This was a bizarre turn of events, a public vow broken with such audacious deception, all for the sake of the empire's security. Or so Eudocia claimed. For a few years, Eudocia and Romanos IV ruled together. Romanos, as expected, took charge of the military campaigns leading the Byzantine armies against the Seljuk Turks. Eudocia continued to manage the internal affairs of the empire, ensuring the smooth running of the court and the state. Their partnership was not always easy, however. Romanos, a proud and ambitious man, increasingly sidelined Eudocia and her sons from power. The Ducas family, her own powerful relatives, resented Romanos's rise and his diminishing of their influence. The turning point came in 1071 CE at the Battle of Manzikert. Romanos IV led a massive Byzantine army against the Seljuk Turks. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantines. Romanos IV was captured by the Turks, a humiliation almost unheard of for a Byzantine emperor. While he was in captivity, John Ducas, Eudocia's brother-in-law and a powerful senator, seized the opportunity. He orchestrated a coup in Constantinople, declaring Eudocia's son, Michael VII Ducas, as the sole emperor, effectively deposing Romanos IV. When Romanos IV was eventually released by the Turks after agreeing to a humiliating treaty, he found himself without an empire. He tried to rally support and regain his throne, but he was captured by the Ducas family's forces. In a cruel and horrifying echo of Irene's story, Romanos IV was blinded, a common Byzantine punishment for deposed emperors to ensure he could never rule again. He died shortly after from the injuries. With Romanos gone, Eudocia briefly hoped to regain her position as Empress Regent for her son Michael VII. But the Ducas family, now firmly in control, had no intention of sharing power with her. They saw her as a potential threat, a woman who had already shown she could break her most sacred vows for power. They systematically stripped her of all her authority. Her abdication was not a voluntary step-down, but a forced retirement. John Ducas, a relentless politician, cornered her. He compelled her to abandon her imperial titles and sent her to a monastery. This was a common fate for deposed empresses and powerful women who were deemed dangerous to the ruling faction. Eudocia, The empress who had dared to break her oath and defy convention was now reduced to the life of a nun. Her secular power completely extinguished. She was no longer empress, no longer regent, no longer a political force. She spent the rest of her days in quiet monastic life, a stark contrast to her earlier life of deception and ambition. She died around 1096 CE. Her remarkable and bizarre path from an oath-bound regent to a secluded nun, a testament to the unpredictable nature of Byzantine politics. Number 3. The queen who sold a city to the Pope and ended up murdered in prison. The Kingdom of Naples in the 14th century was a hotbed of intrigue, betrayal, and violence, and at its heart sat Joanna I, a queen whose life was so dramatic it almost sounds like fiction. Born in 1326, she inherited the throne of Naples in 1343 at the tender age of 17. She was young, beautiful, and intelligent, but her reign was immediately plunged into chaos. Her first husband was Andrew of Hungary, a prince of the powerful Anjou family, who were also Joanna's cousins. The marriage was troubled from the start. Andrew was unpopular with the Neapolitan nobility, seen as rude and arrogant, and he was eager to seize more power for himself, even demanding to be crowned king, not just queen's consort. The simmering tensions erupted in the most brutal way in 1345. Andrew was murdered at Varsa, a royal residence near Naples. He was lured out of his bedroom by conspirators, then strangled and thrown from a window. The murder sent shockwaves across Europe. Immediately, suspicion fell on Joanna, her enemies, and there were many whispered that she was involved, perhaps even orchestrating the assassination. Andrew's powerful brother, Louis the Great of Hungary, swore revenge. Joanna vehemently denied any involvement in her husband's death. She was tried and acquitted by the local courts, but the accusations stuck to her like a shroud. Louis of Hungary, calling himself the Avenger of Andrew, invaded Naples with a formidable army in 1347. He swiftly conquered the kingdom, forcing Joanna to flee for her life. This was her first major abdication of power. A forced retreat from her own capital, a moment of profound vulnerability. She fled to Avignon, a city in southern France that was then the seat of the papacy. The Pope, Clement VI, was Joanna's feudal overlord, and she hoped he would offer her protection and validate her claim to the throne in Avignon. Joanna faced a public trial at the papal court. It was an extraordinary spectacle. Louis of Hungary pressed his accusations, but Joanna, with her intelligence and charm, defended herself eloquently. She argued that she was innocent and that the kingdom was rightfully hers. The Pope, perhaps, swayed by her arguments, or perhaps seeing an opportunity to assert papal authority over Naples, eventually acquitted her of the murder charges in 1348. But Joanna was still a queen without a kingdom. She desperately needed funds and support to reclaim her throne, and here comes one of the most bizarre acts of her life. Avignon, the very city where she had found refuge and been acquitted, was technically part of the Kingdom of Naples, a small papal enclave within her vast domains. Desperate for money and political leverage, Joanna entered into negotiations with the Pope. In 1348, in a deal that stunned Europe, she formally sold the city of Avignon to Pope Clement VI for 80,000 gold florins. Selling a city was not an everyday occurrence, especially one so strategically important and tied to the papacy. It was an unprecedented move, a queen liquidating part of her hereditary territory, essentially abdicating sovereignty over a valuable piece of land to secure her own survival and future. This act was bizarre, not just for its transactional nature, but for its sheer audacity and its long-term implications for papal power in Europe. With the money, and more importantly the Pope's official blessing and recognition, Joanna felt strong enough to attempt to reclaim her kingdom. Eventually, the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, forced Louis of Hungary to withdraw his troops from Naples. Plague had decimated his army, and the Neapolitan population alike. Joanna seized the opportunity, and with the funds from Avignon and renewed papal backing, she returned to Naples and successfully reclaimed her throne. But her reign was far from peaceful. Joanna was a woman of immense passion, marrying 4 times, each marriage bringing its own set of political complications and personal dramas. She was excommunicated multiple times by various popes for her political maneuvering and her personal life. She forged alliances, broke them, fought wars, and continually navigated the treacherous political landscape of Italy. She was a survivor, always finding a way to bounce back no matter how many times she was seemingly defeated. However, the wheel of fortune eventually turned against her for the last time. In 1378, the Western Schism began, dividing the Catholic Church between rival popes. Joanna made the fateful decision to support Pope Clement VII, based in Avignon, over Pope Urban VI, based in Rome. Urban VI, furious at her choice, declared her a heretic and excommunicated her once more. He then proceeded to depose her from the throne of Naples, claiming she had forfeited her right to rule. Urban VI found a champion for his cause in Charles of Durazzo, another cousin from the Anjou family, and a powerful Hungarian prince, who also had a claim to the Neapolitan throne. Charles invaded Naples with an army supported by the Pope. This time, Joanna, now in her 50s, and perhaps weary from a lifetime of relentless struggle, could not escape. Her forces were defeated and she was captured in 1381. Her final abdication was not a sale of land or a panic flight, but a total forced loss of everything. Charles of Durazzo imprisoned her in the castle of Muro-Lucano. He knew that as long as Joanna lived, her supporters might rally around her. So in May 1382, by Charles's order, Queen Joanna, the First of Naples, was smothered to death in her prison cell, dying at the age of 56. Her turbulent, bizarre, and ultimately tragic reign, marked by murder accusations, selling cities, and constant warfare, ended with a violent final abdication from life itself. Number 2. The Empress who was the rightful heir but stepped aside for her son. The early 12th century in England was a period of brutal conflict known as the Anarchy, and at its heart was a woman named Matilda. She was not just any royal princess. She was the only surviving legitimate child of King Henry I of England. Her father, a man of strong will, had painstakingly arranged for her to be his successor. This was highly unusual for the time, as women typically did not inherit thrones in their own right, especially not in England. But Henry I had no living sons, and he was determined to secure his line. Matilda's life began as a princess, then took an imperial turn. At the age of 8, she was married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, making her an empress. She spent years in Germany, learning the complexities of imperial court life, witnessing powerful political maneuvering, and gaining a reputation for intelligence and ambition. When her husband died in 1125, she returned to England as a widowed empress, still relatively young, highly educated, and with an impressive title. Her father, King Henry I, immediately set about reinforcing her position as his heir. He made his powerful barons and bishops swear an oath to recognize Matilda as the rightful ruler of England and Normandy after his death. This was a monumental pledge given the societal norms. The barons grumbled, but they swore. To further strengthen her position, Henry arranged a new marriage for Matilda in 1128 to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. This alliance was strategically important, but it was also controversial, as the Angevins were traditional rivals of the Norman rulers of England. The marriage, initially stormy, eventually produced 3 sons, securing the line of succession, for Henry I died, albeit through a male heir. When Henry I died, in 1135, everything went wrong. Despite the oaths, a powerful faction of English and Norman nobles immediately broke their promises. They didn't want a woman on the throne, nor did they want an Angevin ruler. They rallied around Henry I's nephew, Stephen of Blois, who swiftly crossed the English Channel, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned King of England. Stephen was well liked. Matilda was furious. She was the rightful heir, recognized by her father and sworn to by the most powerful men in the kingdom. She was the empress, a woman of imperial lineage. She was not about to give up her birthright without a fight. Thus began the anarchy, a devastating civil war that would last for nearly 2 decades. Matilda invaded England in 1139, establishing her base in the southwest. The war was brutal and chaotic. Castles were built and destroyed, lands ravaged, and loyalties constantly shifted. Matilda, supported by her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, a highly respected military commander, proved to be a formidable leader. She was stubborn, resilient. At one point, she famously captured King Stephen himself at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. For a brief period, she was poised to be crowned Queen of England. She even entered London and was preparing for her coronation. But Matilda had a fatal flaw: her haughtiness. She was proud, imperious, and often alienated her supporters, even those who had fought tirelessly for her. When she arrived in London, she made demands that angered the city's citizens and the powerful clergy. As she prepared for her coronation, the Londoners, egged on by Stephen's remaining supporters, rose up against her. She was forced to flee the city in a frantic escape, barely making it out alive. Her chance to be crowned queen slipped through her fingers. The war continued. A grinding stalemate. Matilda gained some ground, then lost it. She never managed to secure enough support to be crowned queen, even though she was often referred to as Lady of the English, acknowledging her claim. Her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, consolidated his power in Normandy, conquering it from Stephen, but he refused to cross to England to fight for her throne. As the years passed, Matilda's eldest son Henry grew into a capable and ambitious young man. He was the son of an empress and a king, a powerful combination. By the late 1140s, it became clear that the next generation was the key to ending the conflict. Henry, now old enough to lead, began to take a more active role in the war. He made his own campaigns in England, demonstrating his military and political acumen. The Civil War had exhausted England. Both sides were weary, and the land was suffering terribly. The church and the nobility began to press for a resolution. King Stephen's own eldest son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly in 1153, a devastating blow to Stephen's cause. This opened the door for a diplomatic solution. Matilda, still fighting, recognized that her son Henry was the future. She had fought for nearly 20 years for her rightful claim, but the opportunity for her own coronation had passed. People might not accept a queen regnant, but they would accept a male heir. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford was signed. This treaty officially ended the anarchy. Its terms were clear. Stephen would remain King of England for the rest of his life, but upon his death, Matilda's son Henry would be his legitimate successor. This was Matilda's ultimate abdication, though it was never formally called that. It wasn't a retreat from power in the traditional sense, but a strategic, painful concession. After fighting relentlessly for 2 decades, enduring countless battles, sieges, and betrayals, she stepped aside. She effectively relinquished her personal claim to the English throne, accepting that the crown would pass to her son rather than directly to her. It was a bizarre, almost self-sacrificing act after so much personal struggle, allowing her son to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. She never wore the English crown. Matilda returned to Normandy and spent the rest of her life as a powerful and influential figure in her son's court. She acted as his chief advisor, particularly during his absences from Normandy. She continued to be known as Empress Matilda, maintaining the dignity and authority of her imperial title. She never ceased to assert her right to the throne, but she recognized that her moment had passed. She died in 1167, leaving behind a remarkable legacy as a woman who fought fiercely for her birthright, only to make the ultimate bizarre decision to step back for the sake of peace and her son's future. The Plantagenet dynasty, which would rule England for centuries, was her legacy. Number 1. The child queen married to her husband's murderer and then discarded. The Byzantine Empire, in the late 12th century, was a place of astonishing wealth and culture, but also of breathtaking brutality and sudden, violent shifts in power. Into this maelstrom arrived a young French princess named Agnes, She was born around 1171, the daughter of King Louis VII of France. Tender age of 8, in 1179 she was sent across Europe to Constantinople to marry the young Byzantine Emperor Alexios II Komnenos. This was a grand alliance, binding the powerful French monarchy to the ancient Byzantine Empire. Agnes arrived in the grand city, a child far from home, thrust into a world of complex politics and ceremony. She was renamed Anna upon her arrival, taking a Greek name in her new home. In 1180, at the age of 9, she was formally married to Alexios II. The ceremony was magnificent, a display of Byzantine pomp and wealth, but it masked a deep instability at the heart of the empire. Emperor Alexios II was only 12 himself, a boy ruler in a court full of ambitious men. The regency for Alexios II was initially controlled by his mother, Empress Maria of Antioch. But Maria was a Latin princess, and her foreign origins made her unpopular with many Byzantines, who resented foreign influence. This resentment boiled over into a full-blown political crisis. The situation was ripe for a strongman to seize power, and one emerged in the form of Andronikos Komnenos. Andronikos was a cousin of the late Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, Alexios II's father, and was a figure of immense charisma, cunning, and ruthlessness. He had a dramatic life filled with adventures, exiles, and daring escapes. He returned to Constantinople in 1182, ostensibly to protect the young emperor and liberate the city from Latin influence. He was welcomed by the populace, who hated the Latins and longed for a strong leader. What followed was a bloody purge. Andronikos instigated a horrific massacre of Latins in Constantinople, slaughtering thousands of Italian merchants and residents who had lived in the city for generations. He then systematically eliminated all his rivals and anyone who might stand in his way, including Empress Maria of Antioch, Alexios II's mother, whom he had strangled. With the path clear, Andronikos set his sights on the throne itself. In 1183, Andronikos, now the de facto ruler, had Alexios II Komnenos, his young cousin and illegitimate emperor, strangled with a bowstring. The 12-year-old emperor, the very boy Agnes had been married to just 3 years earlier, was dead. This act of cold-blooded regicide was a horrifying display of Andronikos's brutality. And then came the truly bizarre and shocking twist for young Agnes. To legitimize his usurpation and to secure the imperial bloodline, decided to marry the child. Empress Agnes was only 12 years old. She was forced to marry the man who had murdered her husband and her mother-in-law. It was a grotesque union, a symbolic act of power and control. Andronikos needed a connection to the imperial lineage, and the young French empress provided that, no matter how unsettling the circumstances. So, Agnes, now Anna, became the Empress of Byzantium. For the second time, but under the most terrifying circumstances imaginable. She was a child bride married to a brutal and aging tyrant. Her days must have been filled with fear and uncertainty, watching Andronikos rule with an iron fist, his reign marked by extreme paranoia and violence. He purged the nobility, executing anyone he suspected of disloyalty, often with horrific tortures. The Byzantine court, once magnificent, became a place of terror. His tyranny alienated everyone, and his cruelties became unbearable. In 1185, while Andronikos was away from the capital, a popular uprising erupted in Constantinople. The populace, desperate and enraged by his brutality, turned on him. Isaac Angelos, a distant relative of the imperial family whom Andronikos had tried to arrest, became the focal point of the rebellion. The mob seized Andronikos when he returned to the city. What followed was one of the most gruesome ends for any emperor in Byzantine history. He was tortured for 3 days, subjected to mutilations, public humiliation, and unspeakable cruelty, before finally being hanged between 2 columns. His reign of terror was over, but not without immense suffering. And what of the child Empress Agnes Anna? With Andronikos dead, she was simply discarded. She was no longer useful to the new regime. She was just a foreign child, a symbolic link to the brutal usurper. Her abdication was not a formal act of stepping down, but a total loss of her imperial status and identity. She was simply cast aside, no longer empress, no longer politically relevant. However, her story was not quite over. Despite the horror she had witnessed and endured, Agnes Anna, now only about 14, was still young and beautiful. The new emperor, Isaac II Angelos, found a new use for her. She was offered to a Byzantine nobleman, a military commander named Theodore Brannus, who held the title of Caesar and was the Lord of Adrianople. Theodore was a much older man, but he was powerful and respected. Agnes Anna married him, becoming his wife, and moving to Adrianople. This was the bizarre final step in her abdication from imperial life. From a French princess destined for the greatest empire in the East to a child empress married to a boy, then married to his murderer, and finally discarded and married off to a local lord. She lived out the rest of her life in relative obscurity. In Adrianople, away from the glittering violent court of Constantinople, she bore Theodore Brannus children and lived a long life, dying around 1240 CE. Her experience moving from the heart of imperial power to its quiet periphery was a stark and bizarre example of how brutal and unpredictable life could be for even the highest-born women in the medieval Byzantine Empire.